The Marshall Islands, a discovery of scale. January 30th, 1944. 0600 hours. Maloelap Atoll, Marshall Islands. Commander Takeshi Yamada, Imperial Japanese Navy, stood on the concrete observation post overlooking the eastern approaches to Maloelap, scanning the horizon with his binoculars for the third time that morning. The sun was rising behind him, painting the Pacific in shades of copper and gold. Below him, the reinforced garrison of 3,200 men waited in their positions. Artillery pieces aimed at the beaches, bunkers stocked with ammunition. Admiral Kobayashi had personally ordered the reinforcement of the outer islands just 6 weeks earlier, and Yamada had worked tirelessly to prepare his men for the American assault that intelligence promised was imminent. But the sea remained empty. Yamada lowered his binoculars and pulled from his jacket pocket a decoded message that had arrived via submarine courier the previous evening. His hands trembled slightly as he read it again. The Americans had landed at Kwajalein. Not here. Not at Maloelap. Not at Vocha. Not at Mili. Not at Jalowit. The outer islands, reinforced at great expense and effort, remained untouched. The Americans had struck directly at the heart of the Marshall Islands chain, bypassing everything. This makes no sense, Yamada whispered to himself, watching the sun climb higher. No invading force bypasses fortified positions. They must be making a mistake. What Yamada didn't know was that he was witnessing not a tactical error, but the emergence of a new kind of warfare, one that rendered his entire strategic framework obsolete. The scale was staggering. The mathematics told a story that would have seemed impossible to any Japanese officer educated in traditional military doctrine. At Kwajalein Atoll, the Americans had assembled 8 battleships, 6 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, numerous heavy and light cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. The carrier force alone could launch more than 700 aircraft. Against this armada, Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama commanded 8,000 men on Kwajalein, of whom only 4,000 were combat-capable soldiers. The rest were construction workers, many of them Korean laborers, and naval aviation support personnel whose aircraft had already been destroyed. But the disparity extended far beyond simple numbers. The American pre-invasion bombardment of Kwajalein Island delivered more explosive tonnage in 2 days than the entire Japanese garrison could have fired in 6 months, with every artillery piece operating at maximum capacity. Battleships fired shells weighing as much as 1,400 pounds, each one. A single American fast carrier could launch as many aircraft in one strike as the entire Japanese air garrison in the Marshall Islands had possessed before the campaign began. The contrast was not merely quantitative, but represented a fundamental difference in industrial capacity, a chasm so wide that traditional military planning became irrelevant. For Commander Yamada and his men on Maloelap, waiting for an attack that would never come, each day of isolation brought new pieces of information that painted an increasingly incomprehensible picture. The strategic logic that had governed his entire military career was dissolving like morning mist under a tropical sun. The strategic background Yamada had served in the Imperial Navy for 22 years. He had been a young officer during the conquest of Manchuria, had watched with pride as Japan's carrier forces demonstrated their superiority in the China campaigns, had celebrated the stunning success at Pearl Harbor. The Marshall Islands had been Japanese territory since the end of the First World War, former German colonies awarded to Japan under the League of Nations mandate. For more than 2 decades, the Navy had developed these scattered atolls as forward bases, constructing airfields, establishing supply depots, building the infrastructure of Pacific defense. The strategic thinking was sound, or so it had seemed. The Marshall Islands formed part of a defensive perimeter extending from the Kuriles in the north through the Marianas, the Carolines, and the Marshalls, down to New Guinea in the south. Any American advance across the Pacific would have to reduce these island fortresses one by one. A grinding campaign of attrition that would exhaust American will and resources. Time was Japan's ally. The Americans, with their soft civilian culture and democratic impatience, would tire of the bloodshed and negotiate a peace that left Japan's essential conquests intact. Admiral Mineichi Koga, commanding the combined fleet, had recognized by late 1943 that the Americans were preparing to strike at the Marshalls. The question was where. The outer islands, closer to American bases in the Gilberts, seemed the logical targets. Koga had ordered Admiral Masashi Kobayashi, regional commander at Truk, to reinforce Jaluit, Mili, Wocha, and Maloelap. Kobayashi had complied, shifting men and equipment, building up garrisons that totaled 28,000 troops across all the Marshall Islands. The defenses were not as strong as Yamada would have liked. Ground fortifications remained subpar, particularly the concrete bunkers and underground positions that might have withstood sustained bombardment. But Tokyo had made a strategic decision, one that Yamada and his fellow commanders understood, even if they didn't entirely accept it. The Marshall Islands were to serve as a delaying action only. The real defensive perimeter would be established much closer to the home islands. The garrisons in the Marshalls were expected to fight, to delay, to exact a price in American blood, but ultimately to die in place. Yamada had accepted this mission with the stoic fatalism expected of an imperial officer. If he and his men were to be sacrificial pieces in a larger strategic game, they would play their role with honor. What none of them had understood was that the Americans were playing an entirely different game. The first morning of silence. January 31st, 1944. The second morning after the American landings at Kwajalein brought no clarity to Maloelap. Yamada stood in the concrete command bunker. A map of the Marshall Islands spread across the wooden table before him. Red pins marked the reinforced outer islands. Blue pins showed the locations of Kwajalein and Eniwetok in the interior of the chain. His intelligence officer, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, a thin man of 34 years who had been a mathematics teacher in civilian life, pointed to the map with a wooden pointer. "Commander, I have confirmed the reports. The American landings are concentrated at Kwajalein Atoll only. Roy Namur to the north, Kwajalein Island to the south. There are no reports of American activity at any outer island positions." Yamada studied the map. "They cannot simply bypass us. That violates every principle of amphibious warfare. You do not leave fortified positions in your rear. You do not expose your supply lines to attack from bypassed garrisons." Nakamura adjusted his glasses. "Nevertheless, Commander, that appears to be precisely what they are doing." A communications officer entered the bunker, handed Yamada a decoded message. It was from the garrison at Wocha, another outer island. Commander Suzuki reported the same situation. The Americans had not approached. His 3,000 men sat in their positions, watching an empty ocean. Yamada felt a cold sensation in his stomach, something he had not experienced since his first combat action as a young ensign. "Lieutenant Nakamura, what do we know about the American force composition?" Nakamura consulted his notes. Reports from Kwajalein before communications were severed indicated a massive fleet. Multiple carriers, many battleships, hundreds of landing craft. Admiral Akiyama's last transmission estimated the American force at more than 200 ships. 200 ships. Yamada tried to visualize such a fleet. The combined fleet in its entirety would struggle to assemble a force of that size. And our air forces? What happened to the reconnaissance flights from Roy Namur? Destroyed on the ground, Commander. American carrier aircraft struck on the morning of January 29th. According to the last reports from Roy Namur, 92 of our 110 remaining aircraft were destroyed before they could take off. Yamada sat down heavily in the wooden chair. 92 aircraft destroyed in a single strike. The entire defensive air capability of the Marshall Islands, eliminated in one morning's work. He thought of the months of effort, the fuel and spare parts carefully hoarded, the pilots trained at great expense. All of it gone in minutes. If Akiyama cannot mount an aerial counterattack, Yamada said slowly, working through the logic. And if the Americans have carrier supremacy, then Kwajalein cannot hold. The garrison will be overwhelmed. Yes, Commander. And if Kwajalein falls, then we here at Malawelap serve no strategic purpose. We cannot threaten American supply lines. We cannot interfere with their operations. We simply sit here consuming supplies, waiting. Nakamura said nothing. The logic was inescapable. Yamada stood, walked to the bunker entrance, looked out at his garrison. Men were drilling in the morning heat, practicing artillery firing procedures, checking ammunition stocks. Good soldiers, all of them, doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Preparing to defend against an enemy who had decided they weren't worth attacking. This isn't right, Yamada said. This isn't how it's supposed to work. The discovery of abundance. February 2nd, 1944. The submarine I-17 arrived at Malawelap just before dawn, running on the surface to recharge batteries. Commander Yamada met the submarine captain, Commander Koichi Tanaka, on the dock. Tanaka was a compact man of 41 years, his face weathered by years of submarine service, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Commander Yamada, Tanaka said, saluting. I bring dispatches from Truk and information about Kwajalein. They walked to Yamada's headquarters, a 2-story concrete building that had once housed German colonial administrators. Inside, over weak tea made from carefully rationed supplies, Tanaka spread a chart on the table. I was ordered to conduct reconnaissance of the American fleet at Kwajalein. I observed the operation for 36 hours from periscope depth, approximately 20 kilometers from the atoll. What did you see? Tanaka's hand shook slightly as he sipped his tea. Commander, I have been a submarine officer for 18 years. I have observed many naval operations. What I saw at Kwajalein... He paused, searching for words. The scale of it defies description. The American transports extended from horizon to horizon. I counted more than 80 large transports and cargo vessels. The escorts numbered at least 40 destroyers. The bombardment force included 8 battleships, more than a dozen cruisers. And the carriers. He looked up at Yamada. I counted 12 carriers. 6 of them were large fleet carriers, each displacing more than 20,000 tons. 12 carriers. Yamada tried to comprehend this. The entire combined fleet possessed 6 large carriers, and most of those were being held back to defend the home islands or were operating in the South Pacific. The bombardment was continuous, Tanaka continued. For 2 full days before the landings, the battleships fired without pause. They were so close to shore that I could see the gun flashes through the periscope. The sound carried underwater, a constant rumbling like an earthquake. I have never seen such an expenditure of ammunition. They must be using up their reserves, Yamada said. That level of consumption cannot be sustained. Tanaka shook his head. That's what I thought initially. But, Commander, I watched the supply operations. Ammunition ships came alongside the battleships every 6 hours. Fresh supplies were transferred constantly. They were not consuming reserves. This was normal operations for them. Yamada walked to the window, looked out at his own modest supply depot. His garrison of 3,200 men had ammunition for approximately 90 days of normal operations, perhaps 30 days if they faced sustained combat. Every shell was carefully inventoried. Every round of rifle ammunition was accounted for. The idea of battleships firing continuously for 2 days, resupplied every 6 hours, suggested a logistical system operating on a completely different order of magnitude. What happened to the defenders? Yamada asked. Kwajalein Island fell on February 4th. According to reports I intercepted, out of Admiral Akiyama's garrison of approximately 5,000 men, only 265 survived to surrender. The rest perished. The American forces reported approximately 100 killed for every 10,000 they landed. 100 Americans killed to eliminate 5,000 Japanese defenders. A 50-to-1 kill ratio, but in favor of the attackers. Traditional military doctrine suggested that attackers should suffer higher casualties than defenders, typically at a ratio of 3-to-1. These numbers inverted everything Yamada understood about amphibious warfare. And Roy Namur fell even faster. The garrison numbered approximately 3,000. 51 Japanese soldiers survived. The Americans lost fewer than 80 men total. Yamada did the mathematics in his head. The Americans had just eliminated 2 Japanese garrisons, totaling 8,000 men, at a cost to themselves of fewer than 200 casualties. They had accomplished in less than 1 week what traditional military planning suggested should have taken months and cost thousands of American lives. Commander Tanaka, you said you observed the supply operations. What else did you see? Tanaka opened a small notebook, consulted his observations. The logistics were extraordinary. I watched troops disembark. They were not simply wading ashore with rifles. They brought tanks, bulldozers, trucks, artillery pieces. The amount of equipment was staggering. On the second day of observation, I watched them unload a portable airfield, complete runway sections, fuel trucks, ground support equipment. By the time I left station, they had already begun constructing runways on captured islands. How is that possible? Airfield construction takes months. I watched them do it in 3 days, Commander. They have equipment and methods we don't possess. Everything is mechanized, systematized, mass-produced. They treated the construction of a military airfield the way we might treat the assembly of a temporary dock. Yamada felt something cold, settling in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but a growing recognition that he was confronting something his training had not prepared him for. What are your orders? Return to Truk. Report my observations. Then patrol the approaches to the Marianas. Will you stop at any other Marshall Island garrisons? Tanaka shook his head. There's no point, Commander. I have orders to conserve fuel and torpedoes for more strategic targets. The outlying garrisons have been effectively neutralized without the Americans firing a shot. You're isolated here. You can't interfere with their operations. You're not a threat, so you're not worth their resources to eliminate. After Tanaka departed, Yamada stood alone in his office. The morning sun streamed through the window. Outside, he could hear his men conducting their daily routines. They were ready to fight. They wanted to fight. But the enemy had decided they weren't worth fighting. He thought about that phrase. Not worth their resources. What kind of enemy possessed resources so abundant that they could choose to ignore 3,000 prepared defenders? What kind of military machine could afford to bypass rather than eliminate threats in its rear? The answer Yamada was beginning to realize, was one operating with an industrial and logistical advantage so overwhelming that traditional military calculations no longer applied. The pattern emerges, February 8th, 1944. A week after the Kwajalein landings, Yamada received a message from Commander Suzuki at Woche. Suzuki reported observing American aircraft flying overhead daily, clearly conducting reconnaissance, but making no hostile moves. American submarines had been detected in the surrounding waters, but they were not attacking. They were simply watching. Yamada assembled his senior officers in the command bunker. Major Kenji Watanabe commanded the ground forces, a solid career officer of 39 years who had fought in China. Lieutenant Commander Isamu Kobayashi led the Naval Aviation Support personnel. Though without aircraft, they had become essentially infantry. Lieutenant Nakamura, the intelligence officer, completed the group. "Gentlemen," Yamada began, "we must recognize our strategic situation clearly. The Americans have taken Kwajalein. They have bypassed Maloelap, Woche, Mili, and Jaluit. We have received no orders from Truk. We have no means of resupply except by submarine, and submarines are urgently needed elsewhere. What are we to do?" Major Watanabe spoke first. "We hold our positions. We wait for the Americans to attack. We make them pay for every meter of ground." "And if they don't attack?" Yamada asked. "They must attack eventually. They cannot leave fortified positions in their rear." "Major, that is traditional doctrine. But the Americans appear to be ignoring traditional doctrine. Commander Tanaka's observations suggest they possess resources sufficient to bypass positions they consider non-threatening. They calculate that containing us is cheaper than reducing us." Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi interjected. "Commander, our supply situation is concerning. We have food for approximately 90 days at current ration levels. We have adequate ammunition, but ammunition without targets is useless. Our medical supplies are limited. If we are truly isolated here for months, we will face serious difficulties." Lieutenant Nakamura had been studying a map. "Commander, I have been analyzing the American strategy. If they can bypass outer islands and strike directly at interior positions, the entire defensive perimeter concept fails. Traditional island defense assumes the enemy must advance linearly, reducing each position in sequence. This allows each garrison to delay the enemy, to inflict casualties, to buy time. But if the Americans can simply leap over positions, then the strategic value of each garrison approaches zero." "Explain," Yamada said. Nakamura used his pointer on the map. "Consider our situation. We have 3,200 men, adequate fortifications, prepared positions. In traditional warfare, the Americans would need to assemble a force of perhaps 10,000 men to reduce this position, possibly more given our defensive advantages. The operation would take weeks, cost them hundreds or thousands of casualties. But instead, they ignore us. Why? Because they calculate that one submarine patrol and occasional reconnaissance flights can neutralize our offensive capability at negligible cost. Meanwhile, they apply their massive force against targets that actually matter strategically." "Which targets matter?" asked Watanabe. "Locations that can serve as bases for further advances. Kwajalein has excellent harbors and airfield sites. Once developed, it becomes a forward base for operations against the Marianas or the Carolines. Our position here at Maloelap offers no such strategic value to them. We're simply not important enough to be worth their trouble." Yamada felt anger rising in his chest. "So we sit here and slowly starve? We surrender without fighting?" "No, Commander," Nakamura said quietly. We sit here and slowly realize that the war we trained to fight no longer exists. The Americans have changed the rules. They possess such overwhelming advantages in resources, industrial capacity, mobility, and firepower that they can afford to fight an entirely new kind of war. They can waste resources we would hoard carefully. They can bypass positions we would feel obligated to reduce. They can mass force at any point they choose and overwhelm any defense we can create. The bunker fell silent. Outside, they could hear the sounds of men drilling, of equipment being maintained, of a garrison preparing for a battle that would never come. Major Watanabe finally spoke. "If what you say is true, Lieutenant, then what hope do we have? How can we possibly win this war?" Nakamura removed his glasses, cleaned them carefully with a handkerchief, replaced them. "Major, I don't believe we can win. Not against an enemy with such advantages. The question is whether our leaders in Tokyo recognize this reality, or whether they will continue to expend garrisons like ours in a strategy that no longer functions." Yamada stood. "Gentlemen, we will continue to prepare our defenses. We will maintain discipline and readiness, but we will also begin to reduce rations slightly to extend our supply timeline. If we are to be bypassed rather than attacked, we may be here for a very long time." After the meeting, Yamada sat alone in his office, writing in his journal. He wrote about Commander Tanaka's observations. He wrote about the mathematics of resource disparity. He wrote about the growing realization that traditional military doctrine was becoming obsolete in the face of overwhelming industrial might. He wrote, "We have prepared to fight with courage and skill. But courage and skill may no longer be sufficient against an enemy who can afford to ignore us entirely. What does it mean when the enemy considers you not dangerous enough to bother killing?" The evidence accumulates. February 14th, 1944. 2 weeks after the Kwajalein landings, a Japanese scout plane from Truk made a high-altitude reconnaissance run over Kwajalein. The aircraft survived long enough to transmit photographs before being shot down by American fighters. Copies of those photographs reached Maloelap via submarine courier 3 days later. Yamada developed the photographs in the darkroom he had set up in the basement of headquarters. As the images emerged in the chemical baths, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Kwajalein Island, which had been defended by 5,000 Japanese troops 2 weeks earlier, had been completely transformed. American construction crews had cleared the rubble, bulldozed the destroyed fortifications, and laid down 2 complete runways. Fuel storage tanks dotted the landscape. Aircraft were parked in neat rows. A harbor full of ships suggested extensive logistical operations. The Americans had converted a hard-won conquest into an operational base in fewer than 15 days. Yamada brought the photographs to Lieutenant Nakamura. The intelligence officer studied them with a magnifying glass, counting aircraft, identifying ship types, noting the scale of construction. "Commander, I count approximately 80 aircraft on the ground. That's a complete air group. The ships in the harbor suggest they're bringing in supplies at a rate of several thousand tons per day. The runway construction indicates they have specialized engineering units with heavy equipment. How long would it take us to construct a base of this sophistication?" Yamada asked. Nakamura considered. "Starting from zero, with our logistical capabilities, I would estimate 6 to 8 months minimum, and that would require constant supply shipments, which we can no longer guarantee with American submarines and aircraft, interdicting our routes." They did it in 2 weeks. "Yes, Commander." Yamada walked to the window, looked out at Maloelap's defenses. His men had spent months constructing bunkers, digging trenches, emplacing artillery. The work had been accomplished with hand tools, limited cement, and improvised materials. The fortifications were adequate but crude. Looking at the photographs of Kwajalein, he saw mechanized perfection. American construction crews with bulldozers and cranes and specialized equipment transforming a devastated island into an operational base faster than a Japanese garrison could build basic defensive positions. The disparity is not just in fighting capability, Yamada said. It's in every aspect of military operations. Construction, logistics, supply, maintenance, everything. Yes, Commander. And if I may be frank, this has implications beyond the Marshall Islands. If the Americans can do this here, they can do it anywhere. Each island they capture becomes a forward base for the next operation. They're not just defeating our garrisons. They're building a logistical chain that extends their reach ever closer to the home islands. Yamada felt cold despite the tropical heat. He thought about the strategic plans he had studied at the Naval Academy, the confident assertions that American democracy lacked the will to sustain a long war. That Japanese defensive positions would exact such a terrible price that the Americans would eventually negotiate. Those plans assumed rough parity in capabilities. They assumed the Americans would fight the war Japan expected. They didn't account for an enemy who could simply change the rules of engagement. Lieutenant, I want you to prepare a detailed report. Document everything we've observed, everything Commander Tanaka reported, everything these photographs show. I'm going to send it to Truk via the next submarine courier. Commander, do you believe they'll read it? Do you believe they'll change their strategy? Probably not. But perhaps someone needs to tell them the truth about what we're facing here. Perhaps someone needs to say clearly that our defensive strategy has been rendered obsolete. Nakamura nodded. I'll prepare the report. But, Commander, I suspect many officers are coming to similar conclusions. The question is whether the High Command is willing to hear them. That night, Yamada couldn't sleep. He lay in his small quarters, listening to the sound of waves against the coral reef. He thought about his 2 decades of service, the battles he had fought, the victories he had celebrated. Everything had been in service of a strategic vision, that Japan could build an empire, could defend it with superior fighting spirit and tactical excellence, could outlast an enemy too soft and too democratic to sustain the necessary sacrifices. But what if the premise was wrong? What if superior fighting spirit meant nothing against an enemy who could bring 12 carriers to a single operation? What if tactical excellence was irrelevant when the enemy could afford to bypass your positions entirely? What if American democracy, rather than being a weakness, enabled an industrial mobilization that authoritarian systems could not match? These were dangerous thoughts. They bordered on defeatism. But Yamada had been trained as an officer to assess reality, to analyze situations clearly, to make decisions based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. And all the evidence was pointing in one direction. The war, as Japan had planned to fight it, was already lost. The only question was how long it would take for everyone to realize it. The Human Dimension, February 20th, 1944. Private First Class Kazuo Tanaka was 22 years old, the son of a rice farmer from Niigata Prefecture. He had been drafted 18 months earlier, given basic training, and shipped to Maloelap as part of the reinforcement that Admiral Kobayashi had ordered. He was a good soldier, reliable and conscientious, if not particularly skilled. He served in an artillery battery, helping to maintain a 75mm gun that pointed at a beach the Americans had decided wasn't worth attacking. Yamada made a habit of walking through the garrison daily, talking with men at their posts. He found Private Tanaka cleaning the artillery piece with meticulous care, treating each component as if the gun were a sacred object. Private Tanaka, you maintain your equipment well. Tanaka stood, bowed. Thank you, Commander. My father taught me that tools last longer if you treat them properly. A good lesson. Tell me, Private, what do you think about our situation here? Tanaka looked uncomfortable. Privates were not usually asked for their opinions. Sir, I think we are ready to fight. The gun is ready. The ammunition is ready. We wait for the Americans. And what if the Americans don't come? Tanaka's face showed confusion. But sir, they must come eventually. We are here. They cannot simply ignore us. Yamada studied the young soldier. He saw in Tanaka's face the confidence of clear doctrine, the certainty that comes from understanding one's role. Private Tanaka knew he was supposed to fight, supposed to defend his position, supposed to make the enemy pay for every meter of ground. He had accepted that he would probably die doing this, but he had not considered the possibility that his sacrifice might be meaningless, that the enemy might simply decide he wasn't worth killing. Private Tanaka, if the Americans don't attack, if we simply sit here for months, what will you do? I will continue to maintain the gun, sir. I will stand ready. I will do my duty. Yamada nodded. Good. Continue your work. He walked on, troubled. How many men in this garrison were like Private Tanaka? Good soldiers, willing to fight and die, but unable to comprehend a strategic situation that made their courage irrelevant. How did you explain to such men that they had been rendered obsolete not by cowardice or failure, but by an enemy who possessed resources so overwhelming that traditional military values no longer mattered? Later that day, Yamada spoke with Dr. Hideo Sasaki, the garrison's chief medical officer. Dr. Sasaki was 51 years old, a civilian physician who had been mobilized when the war began. He maintained a small hospital in a converted storage building, stocked with limited medical supplies and equipped with basic surgical instruments. Doctor, how was the health of the garrison? Dr. Sasaki cleaned his glasses. Physically, the men are well enough. Adequate nutrition, no major diseases. But, Commander, I am concerned about morale. The men expected to fight. They prepared themselves mentally for combat. But now they sit, day after day, watching empty seas. Some are beginning to show signs of nervous strain. Insomnia, irritability, symptoms of what we might call anticipatory stress. Can you treat these symptoms? Not really. The cure for their condition would be either combat or release from the constant expectation of combat. I can provide neither. I can only observe as men who prepared themselves to die heroically instead face the prospect of dying slowly from boredom and malnutrition. Yamada had not considered this dimension. His men were suffering not from enemy action, but from its absence. They had accepted the possibility of death in battle. They had not accepted the possibility of irrelevance. Doctor, in your medical opinion, how long can we maintain morale if the current situation continues? Dr. Sasaki considered carefully. 3 months, perhaps 4. After that, I believe discipline will begin to deteriorate. Men will become listless, careless. Not cowardice, Commander, but a kind of spiritual exhaustion that comes from endless waiting for something that never arrives. Thank you, Doctor. Continue your work. That evening, Yamada stood on the observation post, watching the sunset. Below him, the garrison conducted its evening routine. Men cleaned weapons, prepared meals, stood watches. Everything was orderly and correct. But he knew what lay beneath that surface correctness. 3,200 men, slowly coming to realize that their courage and readiness meant nothing to an enemy who had decided they weren't worth noticing. The irony of abundance. February 25th, 1944. The submarine I-23 arrived with supplies and mail. The submarine captain, Commander Hiroshi Matsumoto, brought news from Truk and beyond. Commander Yamada, I have intelligence reports you need to see. In Yamada's office, Matsumoto spread documents across the desk. The Americans struck Eniwetok on the 17th. The atoll fell by the 21st. Similar pattern to Kwajalein: overwhelming force, massive bombardment, rapid reduction of the garrison. Casualties? On Engebi Island, the Japanese garrison numbered approximately 800 men. Fewer than 30 survived. On Eniwetok Island itself, the garrison was approximately 800 men. 37 Americans killed. And on Parry Island, the bombardment was so effective that the Marines secured the island in one day with minimal casualties. Yamada studied the reports. The pattern was repeating. Massive American forces overwhelming prepared defenses with shocking efficiency. What else? Matsumoto pulled out another document. This is a captured American document, retrieved from a damaged landing craft at Kwajalein. Our intelligence people translated it. It's a logistical manifest detailing supplies loaded for the operation. Yamada read the document carefully. The figures were staggering. For a single day of operations at Kwajalein, American forces had allocated 12,000 tons of ammunition, 8,000 tons of fuel, 15,000 tons of food and supplies, 2,000 tons of construction materials. And this was described as standard daily allocation for amphibious assault operations. Commander Matsumoto, are these figures accurate? 12,000 tons of ammunition for a single day? Our translators confirmed the numbers multiple times. Commander, a single day of American operations at Kwajalein consumed more ammunition than our entire garrison here at Maloelap possesses for its complete defensive campaign. Yamada did the mathematics. His artillery and small arms ammunition stores totaled approximately 800 tons. The Americans, in one day, used 15 times that amount. And they did so not because they were wasteful, but because they could. Their logistics system could deliver that level of supply without strain. What about waste? Yamada asked. Surely they must be accumulating excess supplies, stockpiling materials. Matsumoto shook his head. Actually, the report suggests the opposite. After securing Kwajalein, American construction crews bulldozed huge quantities of damaged equipment and supplies into the ocean. Things we would carefully salvage and repair, they simply discarded and replaced. A damaged truck? Pushed into the lagoon? Damaged construction equipment? Scrapped immediately and replaced with new. The document notes that replacement supplies were scheduled to arrive within 48 hours. Yamada stood, walked to his window. Outside, he could see his own modest supply depot. Every item was carefully cataloged and conserved. Damaged equipment was repaired using improvised parts and ingenuity. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted. The supply chain was too fragile, the distances too vast, the available resources too limited. And the Americans were pushing damaged trucks into the ocean because replacing them was easier than repairing them. It's not just that they have more resources, Yamada said slowly. It's that they operate on a completely different paradigm. We conserve because we must. They waste because they can. Every aspect of their military system is built on assumptions of abundance rather than scarcity. Yes, Commander. And that changes everything. Matsumoto pulled out a final document. This is a British observer's report from Kwajalein. A Commander Anthony Kimmins of the Royal Navy was present during the assault. He wrote, "The pre-invasion bombardment was the most damaging thing I have ever seen. Nothing could have lived through it. The beach was covered with highly colored fish thrown up by nearby explosions. I have never seen such a shambles in my life. The bombardment was the most brilliant success. Another observer noted that a single American battleship fired more rounds in the pre-invasion bombardment than the entire Royal Navy fired during the Battle of Jutland. Yamada read the reports in silence. He tried to imagine the scene. Battleships firing thousands of rounds, explosions so intense they killed fish in the lagoon, the complete annihilation of defensive positions before a single soldier went ashore. And this was standard procedure for the Americans, their normal operational method. Commander Matsumoto, what are your orders? Continue patrol operations, then return to Japan. Our submarine forces are being redirected to defend the inner perimeter. The outlying garrisons are considered expendable. I understand. Will you carry dispatches? Yes, of course. Yamada handed Matsumoto a sealed envelope. Please deliver this to Admiral Kobayashi at Truk. It contains my assessment of our strategic situation. I believe he should understand what we are facing here. After Matsumoto departed, Yamada sat alone with the American logistics document. He studied the figures again, checking his calculations. 12,000 tons of ammunition per day. 8,000 tons of fuel per day. These were not the supplies for a desperate offensive, a last-gasp effort consuming reserves. These were routine daily allocations, sustainable indefinitely. Japan's entire annual steel production, carefully husbanded and allocated, was less than the amount of steel the Americans were expending in a single month's operations across the Pacific. Japan's entire oil reserves, for which they had gone to war in the first place, were being matched by American consumption in a matter of weeks. The strategic calculus on which Japan's war plans had been built was simply wrong. They had assumed rough parity in industrial capacity. They had assumed American softness would translate to military weakness. They had assumed Japanese fighting spirit could compensate for material disadvantages. But material disadvantages of this magnitude could not be compensated. When one side could afford to discard damaged trucks, while the other side carefully salvaged every bolt and screw, no amount of fighting spirit could change the eventual outcome. Yamada opened his journal and wrote, "Today I understood that we are not fighting a war. We are witnessing an execution. The Americans have already decided the outcome. They are simply working through the mechanical process of applying their overwhelming advantages until we have no choice but to surrender. The courage of our men, the skill of our officers, the sacrifice of our garrisons, all of it is irrelevant to the final result. We are the last defenders of a castle that fell months ago. We simply haven't received word that the war is over." The psychological transformation, March 5th, 1944. More than a month had passed since the American landings at Kwajalein. Maloelap remained untouched, forgotten, irrelevant. Yamada's garrison continued its routines, but he could sense the slow erosion of the purpose. Men performed their duties correctly, but mechanically. The alert anticipation of early February had been replaced by a kind of resigned waiting. Yamada held a meeting with his officers. Major Watanabe, Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi, Lieutenant Nakamura, and the other section commanders gathered in the command bunker. "Gentlemen, I must be frank with you about our situation. We have now been bypassed for more than 30 days. Our supplies are adequate, but not infinite. We have received no orders from higher command beyond the general directive to hold our position. I believe we must discuss our options." Major Watanabe spoke first. "Commander, our duty is clear. We hold this position until ordered otherwise or until the Americans attack. There are no other options. Major, I respect your commitment. But consider our actual strategic value. Can we threaten American operations? No. Can we interdict their supply lines? No. Can we provide any meaningful resistance to their advance? No. We are 3,000 men consuming supplies, maintaining equipment, and accomplishing nothing. Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi interjected. Commander, are you suggesting we surrender? That would be dishonorable. I'm not suggesting surrender. I'm suggesting we acknowledge reality. We were positioned here to delay the American advance. But the Americans have decided we're not worth delaying for. We're like a lock on a door that the enemy has chosen to go around rather than break. Lieutenant Nakamura had been listening quietly. Commander, may I speak frankly? Please. I believe Commander Yamada is correct. We are experiencing a crisis not of courage, but of relevance. Our military doctrine prepared us to die heroically in defense of strategic positions. But we cannot die heroically if the enemy refuses to attack us. We cannot fulfill our mission if the enemy has rendered our mission meaningless by changing the fundamental nature of the war. Then what do we do? Asked Watanabe. We survive, Yamada said. We maintain discipline. We conserve supplies. We document what we've observed. When this war ends, however it ends, there will need to be an accounting. Someone will need to explain how our strategy failed so completely. We can serve that purpose by surviving to tell the truth. The room fell silent. What Yamada was suggesting was almost heretical. Officers of the Imperial Navy were expected to choose death over surrender, to fight until the last round was expended, to never acknowledge the possibility of defeat. But Yamada was not suggesting surrender. He was suggesting something more subtle and perhaps more subversive, surviving with the purpose of bearing witness. Over the following days, Yamada worked on his journal with new purpose. He documented everything. Commander Tanaka's observations of the American fleet, the logistics reports from captured documents, the photographs of Kwajalein's transformation, Dr. Sasaki's notes on the psychological toll of purposeless waiting, Private Tanaka's careful maintenance of a gun that would never fire in anger. He wrote about the strategic implications. He wrote about resource disparities that could not be overcome by courage or skill. He wrote about what happens when one side can afford abundance while the other practices desperate conservation. He wrote about the obsolescence of traditional military doctrine in the face of overwhelming industrial might. And he wrote about his own transformation. I entered this war believing in Japanese superiority, he wrote. I believed our fighting spirit, our tactical excellence, our warrior traditions would overcome any material disadvantage. I was wrong. Courage without resources is merely martyrdom. Skill without support is merely feudal competence. Tradition without adaptation is merely obsolescence. I have watched my entire understanding of warfare become irrelevant, and I have no one to blame but my own previous arrogance in assuming that our way of war was the only way of war. March 15th, 1944. Yamada received word that Truk had been attacked by American carrier forces. The great naval base, headquarters of the combined fleet, had been struck by more than 500 American aircraft. Dozens of ships had been sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, the base facilities severely damaged. Truk, which had been considered impregnable, had fallen without any ground assault at all. The Americans had simply struck from the sea with overwhelming carrier air power, devastated the base, and moved on. They had not bothered to invade. They had rendered Truk as irrelevant as they had rendered Maloelap. Yamada showed the dispatch to Lieutenant Nakamura. They're doing it everywhere. bypass, strike, move forward. They're not following any traditional pattern. They're simply applying overwhelming force wherever they choose, ignoring anything that doesn't serve their immediate purposes. Yes, Commander. And there's something else you should know. I've been analyzing the pattern of American advances. From the Gilberts to the Marshalls took approximately 2 months. If they maintain this pace, they could be in the Marianas by summer. The Marianas, Commander, within bomber range of the home islands. Yamada felt the full weight of that realization. When he had left Japan 18 months earlier, the Marianas had been secure rear areas, islands where children played and families lived normally. The idea that American bombers might be striking the home islands by the end of the year would have seemed absurd. But now, watching the relentless efficiency of the American advance, it seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Lieutenant, I want you to do something. Calculate how long our supplies will last if we reduce rations to subsistence levels. Commander, the men are already on reduced rations. I know. But calculate true subsistence. How long can we survive? Nakamura pulled out his notebook, worked through figures. At subsistence level, conserving every resource, assuming we supplement with local fishing and coconuts, we could survive approximately 8 months, perhaps into November. And if the war continues past November, then we slowly starve, Commander. Or we surrender. Or we attempt to evacuate by submarine, which seems unlikely given the submarine force has been redirected to more critical missions. Yamada nodded slowly. So, we have 8 months to document what we've observed. 8 months to bear witness. That will have to be enough. The final understanding, April 10th, 1944. 3 months after the American bypassing of Maloelap began. Yamada stood on the observation post at dawn, as he had done every morning of his command. The sun rose over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The ocean stretched empty to the horizon. His garrison went about its morning routines below him. Everything was orderly and correct. He thought about the numbers he had accumulated. The Americans had assembled more than 200 ships for the Marshall Islands campaign. They had landed more than 40,000 troops across multiple atolls. They had expended hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies. They had constructed multiple operational bases in a matter of weeks. They had completed the entire campaign 10 weeks ahead of their own schedule. And they had done all of this with fewer than 500 casualties. 500 American casualties to eliminate more than 25,000 Japanese defenders and capture an entire island chain. Not 500 casualties per operation. 500 casualties total for the entire campaign. Yamada tried to find a historical parallel and could not. No military campaign in history had achieved such complete success at such low cost to the attacker. The disparity was not merely significant, it was absolute. He thought about the garrison commanders at Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Men like himself who had prepared their positions, motivated their troops, planned their defenses according to established doctrine. They had done everything correctly. They had fought bravely. Nearly every single one of them had died in the attempt. And the Americans had swept past their sacrifices as if they were minor obstacles, barely worth noting. He thought about Admiral Akiyama, who had faced the terrible realization that his aerial counterattack capability had been destroyed in a single morning. Akiyama had done his duty, had led his men in desperate infantry charges, had died fighting. But his death had changed nothing. The Americans had taken Kwajalein on schedule, had transformed it into an operational base, and had moved on to the next target, as if Akiyama's sacrifice had been merely a minor delay in an otherwise smooth operation. And he thought about himself. Standing on this observation post, commanding 3,000 men who maintained their weapons and drilled their formations and prepared for battles that would never come. They were as irrelevant as the fortifications on the bypassed outer islands. The Americans had decided they weren't worth killing, and in making that decision, they had inflicted something worse than death. They had inflicted absolute meaninglessness. Yamada opened his journal one final time. He wrote, "Today I understand the full truth of our situation. We did not lose because we fought poorly. We did not lose because we lacked courage. We did not lose because our leaders made tactical errors. We lost because we entered a contest in which the fundamental rules favored our opponent so overwhelmingly that the outcome was never in doubt. The Americans possessed industrial capacity so vast, resources so abundant, logistical systems so efficient, and technological advantages so complete that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could possibly compensate. We were fighting the previous war, applying lessons learned from conflicts between relatively equal powers. But the Americans were fighting a new kind of war, one based on absolute material supremacy. They did not seek to defeat our military. They sought to render our military irrelevant by moving around it, over it, past it, and they succeeded. The Marshall Islands campaign demonstrated that traditional military virtue, courage, sacrifice, loyalty to duty, all the values we held sacred, had become strategically meaningless in the face of overwhelming industrial might. We were brave. They were powerful. They won." The epilogue, 70 years later, September 15th, 2014. The Marshall Islands National Museum, Majuro Atoll. An elderly man, Professor James Matthews, 78 years old, stood before an exhibit case containing artifacts from the 1944 campaign. He was giving a tour to a group of university students studying Pacific War history. "This," he said, pointing to a faded journal in the case, "is the diary of Commander Takeshi Yamada, Imperial Japanese Navy. He commanded the bypassed garrison at Maloelap Atoll during the American campaign. Unlike most Japanese garrison commanders who died in combat or chose suicide, Yamada survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in September 1945 after Japan's capitulation." A student raised her hand. "Professor, why is his diary significant?" Matthews smiled. "Because it represents one of the most honest assessments of the Marshall Islands campaign from the Japanese perspective. Most Japanese accounts emphasize courage, sacrifice, and warrior spirit. Yamada's diary emphasizes something else. The moment when a professional military officer realized that courage and sacrifice were no longer sufficient, he documented in real time the psychological experience of strategic obsolescence. He pointed to a specific entry, preserved behind glass. Here, dated March 5, 1944, Yamada writes about resource disparities. He calculated that a single day of American operations consumed more resources than his entire garrison possessed for their complete defensive campaign. He understood, months before the war ended, that Japan had lost not because of any failure of courage, but because of absolute material disadvantage. Another student asked, "What happened to Yamada after the war?" He became a professor of military history at Tokyo University. He spent the rest of his life, he died in 1992, studying the relationship between industrial capacity and military outcomes. His doctoral thesis argued that World War II in the Pacific was effectively decided not by battles, but by factory production rates. He calculated that by 1942, American industrial output had already grown so large that Japanese victory was mathematically impossible, regardless of tactical successes. "That seems like a depressing conclusion," the student said. "Perhaps, but also liberating in a way. Yamada's garrison at Malawailap survived the war because the Americans never attacked them. They simply waited there, maintaining their positions, watching the war pass them by. When Japan surrendered, Yamada ordered his men to lay down their arms peacefully. Not a single man was lost." In his later writings, Yamada argued that military commanders have a duty not just to their nation's glory, but to their soldiers' lives. "Sometimes," he wrote, "the most courageous decision is to recognize when further resistance is futile, and to preserve life rather than waste it in meaningless sacrifice." The students moved on to other exhibits. But Matthews remained before Yamada's diary for a long moment. He thought about the Marshall Islands campaign, completed in less than 3 weeks at a cost of fewer than 500 American lives. He thought about the 25,000 Japanese defenders who had died defending positions that, in the larger strategic picture, had proven almost irrelevant. He thought about industrial capacity and resource disparities and the ways in which wars are won not by the bravest soldiers, but by the most productive factories. The diary lay open to a specific page, Yamada's entry from April 10th, 1944. The final lines were visible through the glass. "We prepared to fight with courage. We found ourselves fighting with obsolescence. History will judge not our bravery, but our failure to understand the war we were actually in. The Americans did not defeat us. They simply built a machine so powerful that our resistance became irrelevant." Matthews turned away from the exhibit and walked to the museum's large window. Outside, modern Majuro bustled with activity. Tourists and locals, the ordinary business of a peaceful Pacific island. In the harbor, cruise ships docked alongside cargo vessels. The concrete runways built by American construction crews in 1944 still served the atoll, now as a civilian airport. The war was 70 years past, a matter of history and memorials. But the lesson remained. In a conflict between courage and capacity, between spirit and resources, between tradition and innovation, the outcome is decided not by the bravest hearts, but by the most productive systems. The Marshall Islands campaign had demonstrated this truth with brutal clarity. The Americans had won not because they fought better, but because they could afford to fight differently, to bypass rather than reduce, to overwhelm rather than match, to waste resources in the confidence that more would arrive tomorrow. Commander Yamada had understood this in real time, watching from his bypassed garrison as the war he expected became the war he never imagined. His diary remained as testimony to that understanding, a record of the moment when military virtue confronted industrial reality and discovered itself obsolete. The final irony was that Yamada's garrison at Malawailap, prepared for glorious sacrifice, had instead achieved something more valuable: survival and wisdom. They had lived to tell the truth about what they had witnessed, and in that truth lay a lesson more important than any battle: that wars are won not by those who die most bravely, but by those who understand most clearly the actual nature of the conflict they face. Matthews looked one final time at the harbor, at the peaceful present built on the violent past. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the remnants of the fortifications Yamada's men had so carefully constructed, the artillery pieces Private Tanaka had maintained with such devotion, the bunkers that had never heard a shot fired in anger, monuments to preparation for a battle that never came, testimony to the strange cruelty of being deemed too insignificant to kill. And in the museum behind him, Yamada's diary bore witness to the truth they had discovered: that sometimes the most devastating defeat is not death in battle, but survival in irrelevance.